Hi, I'm Mark Bates, and you've reached the Rabbit Room Apologetics podcast. So, thank you for that. So today we're doing something a little bit different. This is a special broadcast. I was watching a YouTuber that I enjoy. His name he goes by Daily Dose of Wisdom, his channel, and he talks about Christian things, and he invites a lot of people that he interviews. It's a very good channel. And so here's the one I saw today that I had to respond to. So I will put the link on in the description just so you can find him if you want to easily. But he's a good guy. So what he was saying is he was commenting on a video that was presented by Dan McClellan, who's this guy over here, on the Alex O'Connor's Within Reason podcast. Now, Alex O'Connor, Within Reason, is a skeptic. He is not a Christian. He is definitely very much in the secular humanist, if I remember correctly, realm. And they were talking about things, and Dan McClellan claimed to be a Hebrew specialist, and he basically said that throughout the Hebrew Bible, that a fetus is not considered a full legal and moral person, and rather they're treated as property. And I don't have, like, many of my teachers have PhDs in Semitic languages, right? People I've studied under. I don't have a PhD in Semitic languages or Hebrew, but I've been teaching as a Messianic rabbi for 20 plus years. I know my Hebrew fairly well, and I know how the ancient Hebrew commenters thought about most of the stuff, and he doesn't know his Hebrew, okay? So I thought, wow, I've got to respond to this because this fits in. I'm going to move this out of the way here because this fits in perfectly with what we've been talking about. Let me get my face out of the way. There you go. Actually, I think right there is perfect right now. Okay. It fits in perfectly with what we've been talking about, is that if you're reading your Bible and you look at the material that's there, right? It's quite possible to get 2 or 3 different views on what it is. In this particular case, thinking that the Bible says that fetuses are not human, and they're treated as property, really reduces the value of human life. And you're not going to see that held up by definitely Second Temple period Jews, by prophets earlier than that, by definitely any of the New Testament authors and other things. So I said, you know what? I'm good at this stuff. I quickly looked up some stuff. I threw together a paper, and I'm going to show you the paper. I won't read it for you word for word. I will have the paper up on my, I just started a new blog post section where I'll be posting up written material along with links to some of the videos. And I'll have it there, and I'll put that in the description so you can easily get to it. All right? So what this paper is on childbirth and miscarriage in Exodus 21, 22 to 25. And so let's look at the text in question. And this is from the ESV. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman, so 2 guys are fighting, and they hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm. And that's the key one. Her children come out, so her child or her children come out, which means that they're born. And that is the implication that the ESV has, and many other English translations do that, okay? There is no harm. The one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, because there is still issues here, right? I mean, you hit the woman there, right? So there will be a fine for that, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, right? So if the baby dies or the woman dies or both, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Remember, this is Exodus, so that's the type of language they constantly used. And that is definitely there. Now, just so no one gets confused, if you're not familiar with the way the Old Testament reads, everything starts with eye for eye, life for life, right? Stuff for that. And as in Fiddler on the Roof, the master commentator on all things Jew, Tevye would say, if everyone, went around taking an eye for an eye, then we'd all be blind, right? And so when you read further, you put it in context, right? This sets up the establishment that if you're harmed, right, and let's say the harm is that you lose use of your arm and you can't work anymore, or the baby died, or your cow was killed accidentally by my actions, right? Then I owe you something equivalent to that, right? And in Deuteronomy, they set up rules where they can say, well, instead of eye for an eye and life, because that doesn't help anyone, we can have the judges give compensation based upon value, right? If everyone agrees on that. So the idea here is not to enforce this eye for an eye thing literally, right? This is setting up a precedent that the goal here is that if you lost your eye, there is some value in your life for however many years you're going to live, right? And this, by the way, is deeply embedded in at least U.S. Legal systems, right? So an eye, it's going to cause you you're going to slow down a little bit, maybe at work. You may not be able to see properly, so you may not be able to get everything done you want, but there's some value there. And you should be compensated for that loss, right? And that's what this is saying. It's not saying that if you somehow accidentally plucked out my eye, that your eye gets plucked out. It's rabbis have never followed that. Jesus never asked for that. There is value, though, right? You had something very valuable. It was either something you owned or it was part of your body. It was something that affected your livelihood. It was, your child, right? There's value there, and that value needs to try to be recaptured. So that's what we're talking about here, right? All right. Now, what's interesting though, and let me just skip off this real quick and go here to the fact book here on Exodus 21, 22, 25. I don't know if you can quite see that. It didn't quite fit. When you look at all the text, so hundreds of commentaries, all pretty much say very similar things, but they go back and forth here. But when you look at all the texts, and the thing that most people get really annoyed at is like the NIV, okay? And so let me pop this up here a little bit, and let's actually look at that here. If people are fighting, right? Let me shrink this down a little bit so you can see it. Okay. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, so the NIV is taking it as a premature birth, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. Okay? But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, right? It goes on with that. Okay, so that was the NIV. You can see here they said premature birth, right? Let's go ahead and go back to the fact book. Let's go see one of the texts that might be a little more on the liberal side. And we can certainly get that with, here's the New Century Version, right? Okay, this one, they keep the same one come out. I'm not going to find what I'm looking for here too easily. That's okay. The idea is that people are translating this a little bit differently going in there. That's what the Young's, I always like the Young's literal every once in a while. And when men strive and have smitten a pregnant woman, right, and her children have come out, and there is no mischief, he is certainly fined, okay? So, variations on, is this considered a premature birth or something? Overall, right, this is definitely considered premature birth, at least the English translators are saying that, right? So let's go back to the SAV here. And so the word we're looking at here is the word here, yalad, right? And so if I look at yalad and I look at it in the one of my favorite verse or tools is the TWOT, right? This is a variation off yalad. Yalad is a normal word for a child, particularly a man, a boy child, right? But you got to be careful with that, okay? Because Isaac, right? In Abraham and Isaac's story, right? When he's going up on the mountain for what's called the Akedah, or the sacrifice, right? The Bible says, and the child, right? The yalad goes with you. And so a lot of English translators immediately convert that into young son. And a lot of movies I've seen on that scene show him as like a 10, 12, 13-year-old boy going up the mountain. But Jewish commentators would constantly point out that, okay, wait a minute. He goes up on the mountain. God shows Abraham the ram. He sacrifices the ram. They come down from the mountain, and he gets married. He's not 13. Okay? So, yalad here in Hebrew can mean a young child, right? But usually it has something that identifies it that way. Otherwise, it really is the son, right? It is really what you're looking for here, right? But when it's got the right, the yalad here, right, in its narrowest sense, describes the act of a woman giving birth to a child, right? And this is, and trust me, there are known ways of describing if the birth was a stillbirth or if it was a miscarriage. Okay, so the Hebrew here is definitely, she's giving an early birth to the child. All right, something that I'm sure Dan doesn't have access to is the halot, which is the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. This is considered the top lexicon by many people. And once again, here you're seeing the idea here. We're talking about a child, right? And when we get down here, we're talking about giving birth to a child, right? There's nothing about this being a miscarriage, okay? So he may not have some access to some of the Hebrew notes that I have, which is absolutely fine. Not everyone has to have all the notes that I have. But I've got 20 years experience working in Hebrew. He's wrong if he thinks this means miscarriage. Okay. So here's my abstract here. So Exodus 21, 22 to 25 has provoked intense exegetical and ethical reflection because a small number of Hebrew words determine whether an injurious incident involving a pregnant woman triggers monetary compensation or the lex talionis, right, life for life. The study analyzes the Hebrew text and its range of meanings, reviews textual witness, the Septuagint and the Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls. And I don't think when I looked at the other video, Dan didn't seem to really know what the Qumranis and the DSS scrolls were saying on this topic, and he made some mention of what the Septuagint said, but or how it was developed. Okay, situates the law in the ancient Near Eastern causistic tradition, right? And causistic, if you're not familiar with that word, it deals with specious or deceptive or over subtle reasoning. Okay, so that means reading too much into the text. So anyone who's trying to read this text, right, here, right, so that her children come out, right, and saying that meant a miscarriage is being overly subtle about the reading. The reading's pretty clear. I surveyed Jewish legal and exegetical responses, both rabbinic and medieval, so the time frame is very important there. And more importantly, and this is something that Dan did not do, is I bring Christian ethical argumentation, especially the doctrine of the Imago Dei, to bear in contemporary application. Okay, and I've got a full paper here. I will, once again, post this paper onto my blog post. I will put the link to this paper in the description so you can download the entire paper. But you can see this is pretty typical how I do papers, right? I define what the issue is. I define the words that are in question. I look at all the additional ancient textual witnesses from the Septuagint. And once again, here, the Septuagint definitely makes the choice that the reading should talk about birth with no harm. A birth that's a miscarriage, the baby's dead, right? There's definite harm there. What the Qumranis said, and that's very important because Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, were written at about the time of Christ. So this is a clear witness for what was a potential thought pattern for most people in that time frame. Obviously, the Qumranis had some different thought patterns than the Pharisees or the Sadducees, but we're looking at in interpreting a specific text like this. The Qumranis give us a good idea what may or may not have actually been out there, and this is their written text. So, one of the biggest problems we have is that other than the Dead Sea Scrolls and the other various sites that are similar, right? There's a whole bunch now that we've found over the last several years. This gives us a view into the Second Temple period and what people were thinking. And even though the Qumranis may have not thought exactly like the Pharisees or the Sadducees, one of the interesting things is that it seems like the Qumranis did not like the Sadducees, and definitely had problems with the Pharisees, and they talk about it in the scrolls. And so we can kind of extrapolate that to say, oh, well, the Pharisees are saying this and the Sadducees are saying this, because the Qumranis are saying, don't follow them on this prohibition, or don't follow them on this ruling. So that's always kind of interesting. Then we get into ancient Near Eastern law and comparative context and how other people groups in the area handle that. Then we pulled into rabbinic and medieval Jewish exegesis. Now this is interesting because once you start getting into medieval Jewish time exegesis, this is where the commentators start hedging their bet and saying, well, it could mean, an early birth. It could mean, the baby was harmed. Okay? They're hedging their bet here. And part of the reason they're hedging their bet is if they consider the birth to have caused harm, but it was not a full birth, right? In some rabbinic minds, especially when we start getting into the Middle Ages, then it's not a full value human. And so it's not a life for a life kind of an issue. I disagree with that, but that's okay, right? So that's where this type of thought pattern starts coming out. We look at textual criticism, harmonization, and the LXX problem. Emmanuel Tov, who's one of the greatest Hebraists in the world, living in Jerusalem, found a paper of his that addresses this specifically, right? We looked at a synthesis of the law, stats, and protection of life in terms of the Hebrew text, ancient witnesses, and Jewish legal tradition. And what does that mean in regards to this specific incident? And finally, and this is what neither side actually pulled out very much, was the Christian reflections about the Imago Dei, and how that, from a Christian perspective, gives us a high sense of priority on all protection of human life. And so when we read texts that don't specifically say that this caused harm to the baby, right? We shouldn't assume that it does. Okay, so we're looking for stuff like that, and I bring some of these points in here. Talk about some of the Roman Catholic teachings, some of the Protestant ethical positions, well, even what some of the Eastern Orthodox perspectives are. I've got some papers, Eastern Orthodox papers, I was able to pull into this. And then talked a little bit about what are the practical consequences of how these two views look, and then a short conclusion. And then one of the things you'll always get with my papers is you get all the paper in all the different areas that I'm quoting from. And so that's in these notes. And of course, anything in here that says Rabbit Room Apologetics Workspace, this means this is an electronic document that I have on my computer. And you'll see the vast majority of these tend to be Rabbit Room Apologetics Workspace documents. You still get who wrote it, what the document was, so you can search these up very easily on your own, and even the page numbers being referenced. But the idea is that I didn't go to the library to find these documents. These are in my electronic library, so to speak, right? So all of these papers were referenced to put this paper together, and then here's the bibliography broken down. And so if you're interested in stuff like this, this will be on my blog posts. I'll post the paper up there so you can get it. If you have questions for me, you can ask me either here on YouTube, on the chat, or you can ask me on the blog. You can send me an email or comment there. But the idea here, this was so in perfect timing for what we're discussing, which is a verse, right? And how it gets interpreted differently for many different reasons. And how does that affect the way you read the text and how you're interacting with it? So, hope that gave you something to think about, right? My position, as you clearly heard, is that this had nothing to do with harming the baby. This is not going to be something that you would consider this to be some sort of an abortion or a stillbirth, right? So I really don't think that the scholar here had much to say. You can see the link if you want to watch it. Once again, not that, that either scholar had made any glaring mistakes, so to speak. It was more point of view stuff than anything else. But the idea is that I look at things from a Second Temple period viewpoint. I look at it from a DCW, right, viewpoint. DCW had nothing to do with this interpretation here. But I bring in all that older Jewish, early rabbinics, and even later rabbinic commentaries, so you can see that there's, where the thought patterns are changing potentially. And you can see that. And these were not brought in by the other guys because they probably have never been exposed to it, quite honestly. This is kind of a specialty area. And unless you're working with somebody who's been trained in the Messianic community to look at this stuff this way, you may not see it. But I think it adds a lot to what we're discussing. So this was just a great way of saying, hey, there's actually practical use for going through this hermeneutics type of training that I'm doing right now, because you get hit with these things where somebody says, but the Hebrew says that, and all the Hebrew throughout says that fetuses are property and they're not full humans, and this text is not talking about an early birth, but it's talking about, something worse. And so, you know what? That's where you really need to be able to defend your Christian viewpoint and defend the Christian ethics that we want to bring into all of these arguments. So, hope that helps. Ask me questions if you want to. And as always, please, if you haven't done so, think about liking this video, subscribing to the channel, share it with a friend if there's a question here that you have and you want to bounce it off somebody else and have them ask me questions. They might need to see the video. And as always, if you like what you can see what I'm doing here in Logos, I do have a link. You get a 30-day free trial. You get a $10 discount. I mean, yeah, discount's always good, right? So you can do that. And I will put the link in there for my blog post. It's new. It's only a couple of items up there right now. But the idea is that I'm starting to, as I'm writing papers for stuff, I'm putting it on my blog post so that you can see it there. And you can look at what I'm doing and how I'm thinking about stuff. So, hope that helps. Be blessed. Have a good day. And as always, remember, God is good all the time. Thank you.